I got to tell you, there's something about seeing the West Range that always just begins to fill my spiritual cup. There's a calling I get whenever I'm near a mountain. I don't know how long I'll be able to accept the call to climb. It feels harder than it's ever felt before. There's something about getting up to a higher perspective. The higher you get, the further you can see. There's a whole bunch of people in our world who choose the darkness of the valley. They never come up. God's calling them to a higher perspective, and they just don't accept it. Even on this trip, there were guys who got it and guys who didn't get it. There were times that that fog bank just froze a bunch of guys right in their steps, and they broke out their cameras, and they just watched it for a long time. And other guys were too busy to see it. I turned over at one point, and I looked at this guy, Sean, who was bent over. He's literally bent over looking at a wildflower. I was like, you okay, Sean? And he said, you know what, I can't remember the last time I just slowed down enough to look at a flower. And I was like, oh, he gets it. He's getting this. This is perfect. And then there's guys who don't get it. For many of us, you don't have to go to a mountain. It happens daily right around us. A sunset, a sunrise that's all pink and purple and orange. And if you just slow down, you know what? Our whole lives are surrounded by walls. There's the walls of the home and the walls of the vehicle and the walls of our office where we work. And sometimes to just stop and just look, just get a different perspective, a more wide perspective is really important. That's what's going to happen today in this story. It's a story of a blind man who's healed by Jesus. But not only is he physically healed, there's a spiritual healing that's going on where his understanding of who Jesus is starts to grow. It happens right in front of us. Only 12 verses in the book of John are committed to telling us how Jesus turned water into wine. But the story of the blind man getting his sight, 40-some verses. I'm not going to be able to read them all today. I want you to go home and read John chapter 9 when you get a chance, because I'm going to be in this passage for 2 weeks. But this is about physical blindness, spiritual blindness. There are people who say they see things clearly, and you're not seeing things clearly because you've allowed yourself to stay in the darkness of the valley too long. And God calls us to a higher plane. And some of us in this room are on that spiritual journey today. I'm just going to start reading with John chapter 9. Not every verse, but several I want to point out at you. Verse number 1, as Jesus went along, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Okay, this is a first century teaching that if something bad happened in your life, it was because of your sin. Some of us still hold to this today. If you're good, good things will happen. If you're bad, bad things happen. And we ignore the verse where God says it rains on the just and the unjust. The sun shines on the just and the God allows good things to happen to bad people too. And so this philosophy, Jesus puts this to rest pretty fast. Verse 3, neither this man nor his parents sinned, Jesus said. But this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. So that the work of God might be displayed. Why do certain things happen? I don't always know. Why do bad things happen? I don't know. But it's not always about the person. Sometimes it's so the work of God might be displayed around us. The Apostle Paul talks about this. He says, man, I've had a heartache in my life. I asked God 3 times to remove it. Some of you don't know this passage. This is the Apostle Paul, by the way. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 12. I was given a thorn in my flesh, he says, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Paul says, God is saying, I'm working here. I made this man blind for this reason. God allowed this man to be born blind for a very special reason. And I don't care what you're up against, God can use that to do something amazing for his glory. And it can hurt us deeply. It can really crush us. But maybe it's not about us or the person. Maybe it's about what God is working in. And I know some of you were raised in homes where maybe you were taught, you know what, if you have enough faith, if you just had enough faith, God will answer every one of your prayers exactly how you want it. How do you explain Paul? You think Paul didn't have faith? The Apostle Paul, he asked God 3 times. Let me tell you something about God. Sometimes he says no. And does it hurt? You better believe it hurts. I begged God in prayer for all kinds of things, and sometimes God says no. Why? Because he's working in a different direction. He's working for something else. And that's not always easy to accept, but here, Paul says that's what's going on. And Jesus said the same thing, so that God might be displayed in his life. Verse 6, having said this, Jesus then spit on the ground. He made some mud with his saliva, and then he put it on the man's eyes. Gross. I added that last part, by the way. Go, he told the man, wash in the pool of Siloam. So the man went and he washed, and he came home seeing. Oh my gosh, those 3 words, I just love those words. A man who was born blind came home seeing. What was that walk like? Come on, let your imagination run a little bit here. You're blind from birth. Now you're an adult, and suddenly you see, and you go home seeing. What is that walk like? That had to be incredible. Why does Jesus choose to heal this man in this fashion? I have no idea. I don't know. I can speculate a little bit. God made the first man out of the dust of the ground. Jesus will make brand new eyes out of the dust of the ground. Jesus was always trying to show himself connected to the Father. Maybe that's what's going on. Or maybe it's not about the blind man's healing at all. Maybe it's about something Jesus is trying to do in the lives of the blind Pharisees. Let me show you a little more here. The neighbors go crazy when they see that the man is seeing. Verse 10, how then were your eyes open? The neighbors asked. And he replied, the man they call Jesus made some mud, put it on my eyes. He told me to wash in the pool of Siloam. So I went and I washed, and now I can see. Just hang on to this for a moment. I'll come back to it. But they're asking how, and I love that the blind man answers who. We'll come back to that. Verse 14. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. You know, the Pharisees had all these rules about the Sabbath, and one of those rules were you weren't allowed to make mud. Because if you were making mud, it implied you were building something. So mud equaled work, and doing that on the Sabbath was taboo. And here's Jesus about to heal a man's eyes by some mud that he made with his own saliva, but the Pharisees are going to go crazy over this. Verse 16, some of the Pharisees said, this man Jesus is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, how can a sinner do such miraculous signs? So they were divided. Oh my gosh, what kind of person doesn't celebrate with a blind man who's healed? Someone who is more concerned with policy than they are with people. We as leaders here at the church, we have policies that we put in place. They're important. They're meant to protect us, but we have to constantly be evaluating and weighing policies versus people, because people are always more important than policy. And so it's hard to be a leader at Lincoln Christian Church because of all of that. Verse 17, finally they turned again to the blind man, that's the Pharisees. What have you to say about Jesus? It was your eyes that they opened. And the man replied, well, he must be a prophet. They can't handle all this positive testimony for Jesus. So they say, you weren't even born blind. Bring in his parents. Let's ask him. The parents come in and they ask, is this your son? And they say, yeah. And, was he born blind? Yeah. They ask the young man, is these your parents? He goes, I've never seen them before in my life. No, I'm just kidding. That's not there. Don't go look for that. And then questioning the parents, verse 22, his parents were afraid of the Jews, for already the Jews had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ would be put out of the synagogue. That is why his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." In other words, don't ask us these They were afraid of being unsynagogued. Now, I'm going to sound a little judgy here, but I'm not impressed with these parents too much. Their son, they couldn't explain everything about their son. They couldn't answer every question about their son, but this was their son. And they didn't stand by him. They allowed him to stand alone in front of this wolf pack. And they may not have even maybe agreed with him. They may not have liked some of his choices, but he's a son, and that's tough. And I know it sounds judgy, but I'm just not impressed with them. Verse 24, a second time the Pharisees summoned the man in who had been blind. "Give glory to God," they said. "We know that this man Jesus is a sinner." He replied, "Well, whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I do know, though, I was blind and now I see." Wow. That's a verse from one of your favorite hymns. I was blind, but now I see. You know, what's so offensive in this is that those who are sinners are calling the sinless one a sinner. Can you imagine? Who's really blind in this story? It's the Pharisees who are blind. Jesus will point that out next week pretty clearly. This man starts putting together an amazing argument on behalf of Jesus. The man who was healed says, "You know what? There's never been a record of anyone healed of blindness. Am I right about that?" And, yeah, that's right. Not even in all of the Old Testament do you have a story of a blind man being healed. 3 times in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah will say, you'll know who the Messiah is because he'll bring sight to the blind. 3 times Isaiah prophesied it. The Messiah of God will bring sight to the blind. So they knew to look for someone who could do that. But they will not give Jesus the credit for this miracle. And the blind man says, if he can do it, then who is Jesus? He must be equal with God. Sure enough, they throw this blind man out of the synagogue immediately. Then Jesus goes looking for him. I love this. Verse 35. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe the Son of Man, in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me who he is so I might believe in him." And Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking to you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. A lot of questions inside this story. If you read the whole story, if you just start looking for the questions, they happen over and over and over again. The blind man will be asked 5 times how he was healed. He'll answer who. This is important for you and I today. It's how versus who. How versus who in our life. I can't answer how for every question. I'm really not good. I mean, I have strong beliefs, but I'm not good at debating against evolution or the Big Bang Theory. How'd this world come into existence? I don't know how. I know who did it, though. Inside our lives, we get so caught up in asking, how am I going to get through this? Rather than asking, who's going to get me through this? Do you see the difference? How versus who. And they just keep asking him, how? And he keeps saying, the man Jesus. Keeps telling them who did it. I love that. I needed that this week when I was in the mountains. I needed to hear that. The clarity in this man's spiritual journey is also very, very impressive. The clarity starts to unpack. Watch just how this unpacks. In verse 11, when they asked him Jesus is a man. But by verse 17, he says, well, he must be a prophet. And then by verse 33, he says, well, he's got to be a man of God. Nobody else could do this if he wasn't a man of God. And finally, by verse 38, he's calling Jesus Lord. You all are in this transition too somewhere. There are people who are with us every Sunday. You're not quite sure what to do with Jesus is just a good man. And there are others that you've heard enough at this point, you're saying, no, he's more than just a good man. He's got to be a prophet. And then there are some in this room, you've graduated to where you say, Jesus is clearly a man of God. I don't know if he's the Son of God, but he's clearly a man of God. Too much has happened. I can't ignore it. And then there are those of us in this room who have already declared Jesus Lord. He's Lord. He's the Messiah. He's the Christ of God. He's the one we've been waiting for. He is Lord of not only this world, but we have made him Lord of our life. I'm not looking to embarrass anyone. I just want to show you something for a moment. And this is real honesty. Don't feel you have to raise your hand, but for those of us who have accepted that Jesus is Lord, just raise your hand proudly for a moment. You bet. Look, you're surrounded by people who have already, we've come through this transition. We've seen all the stories. There's too much evidence for us to deny anymore. He's the one. And we accept the testimony of these people in the past. Yeah. Because Jesus is Lord, I don't want to go through this life asking how. I need to be asking who. At the end of the week out in Colorado, we turned our attention then to climbing a mountain. We had been up and over the Continental Divide. We had been back in the back country of the mountains. We had been up quite high, but there wasn't very many times we were above the tree line. There's what's called 14ers in Colorado. There's no mountain higher than 14,000 feet, and there's 53 of them. And we gave our attention to climbing Mount Massive. Here's what you need to know about Mount Massive. Mount Massive is the second tallest mountain in Colorado. It's the third tallest mountain in the whole continental United States. In Colorado, Mount Massive sits right next to Mount Elbert. It's so high, there's no trees. The reason there's no trees is because there's not enough oxygen up there for trees. And I was like, hey, let's go up there. And we all went up there, couldn't breathe either. And but we climbed it. 12 of us set our heart to climbing that thing, and 12 of us made it. It was quite an accomplishment. Here's a little history. Back before they surveyed these mountains correctly, because Mount Elbert and Mount Massive sit side by side, just by the visual eye, they argued over which one was higher. And then the day came when things were appropriately surveyed, and they discovered that Mount Elbert was just a few feet taller than Mount Massive. Well, Mount Massive fans climbed up there and started piling rocks up higher to make it taller. And then when Mount Elbert fans heard about that, they climbed Mount Massive and knocked the rocks down. And so anyway, today we clearly know, because of all the lasers and satellite and all that stuff, we know that Mount Elbert is just a little bit higher than Mount Massive. But Mount Massive is a much more difficult climb. And that's the one we wanted to get this year. Mount Massive, because there's more mass above the 14,000-foot mark than any other mountain in the continental United States. It has the most mass up. It was hard. And I'm going to tell you that I struggled. I was tempted to give up a few times. I just sat down and I'm like, this thing is beyond my reach. The trail is harder than I anticipated. The weather is not cooperating. The steepness was more than I was prepared for. My body was not as in good a shape as I thought. The pack back was heavier than I remembered. And there were just times I was tempted to give up. And what I was doing, and that's when this whole sermon kind of came to me. I knew this was going to be the passage this week, so I was just turning it over in my heart over and over and over again. But it was as if I was told today to share this with you. Because at the beginning of climbing Mount Massive, I was asking, how am I going to do this? And it was very defeating. But when I started asking myself, who is going to help me today? I took another step and another step. Sometimes they were small steps, but they were in the right direction. Sometimes they were really slow steps. Sometimes they were painful steps. Let me tell you something about climbing mountains. This isn't going and laying on a beach somewhere and watching waves. If you're going to climb a mountain, you're going to suffer. And it's hard. But just one step at a time, one step at a time. And I ended up reaching what I questioned at one point I could reach. I got to the top. So did 11 others. in our lives right now. I don't know what seemingly impossible mountain is in front of you right now. I don't know where you're hurting and where you're suffering. I know some of you are suffering today. I know the climb for you spiritually has gotten really difficult. Don't get into the trap of asking, how am I going to get through this day? That's the wrong question. Ask yourself, who's going to get me through this day? And I'll bet you come to the same conclusion the blind man did 2,000 years ago. It's Jesus who gets me through this. Oh, I hope you're not trapped in blindness. I hope you see this clearly. It's Jesus saying, I'm right there with you. I'm not leaving you. When you're frustrated, I'm not frustrated. When you're impatient, I'm not impatient. I got this. And when tragedy strikes, you have to remember one thing. God is saying, I'm working here. Just give me a little bit. I'm working. Yeah, I'm tired of the question how. The question who is answered with Jesus, period.